The Montana wilderness breathed in the pre-dawn darkness, and Sarah Mitchell moved through it like a ghost. Her running shoes found purchase on the narrow trail that wound through the ponderosa pine forest surrounding her cabin, her breathing controlled and rhythmic despite the elevation and the cold that burned in her lungs. The thermometer on her porch had read 34 degrees when she'd stepped outside at 4:47 a.m. She always started at 4:47, never 4:45 or 5:00, always the same time, always the same route. Precision was her religion. Her hair, dark and pulled into a severe bun, was already damp with exertion. Her athletic frame moved with an efficiency that suggested every muscle understood its exact purpose. Most people who ran did so to escape something: stress, monotony, the crushing weight of ordinary life. Sarah ran because it kept her sharp, kept her body remembering what it had been trained to do. 8 years of special operations training doesn't simply evaporate because you request discharge. It lives in your muscle memory, in the way you stand, in how quickly you can assess danger in a room. It lives in your bones like radiation. She completed her 5-mile loop in exactly 41 minutes, arriving back at her cabin precisely when she'd calculated. The cabin itself was modest, a 2-bedroom structure that had been built in 1987, updated just enough to pass inspection but not so much that it attracted attention. Inside, the aesthetic was deliberately unremarkable. Hardwood floors, a stone fireplace that actually worked, windows that faced the forest, affordable furniture from mail-order catalogs. The kind of place a reclusive nature photographer might live. Everything designed not to stand out, not to provoke curiosity, not to be memorable. But if someone were truly observant, if they paid attention to details most people overlooked, they might notice things that didn't quite fit. In the master bedroom closet, behind the weathered hiking boots and the outdoor jackets, was a locked steel case containing documents, multiple identities, passports in 3 different names, cash in several currencies, totaling approximately $230,000, a pistol, military grade, fully maintained. Below that, wrapped carefully, was a folder containing photographs so classified that their mere existence was a violation. Sarah hadn't opened that folder in 3 years. She no longer needed to. The images were burned into her memory with a clarity that time hadn't diminished. She showered with cold water, another discipline, and dressed in the uniform of her assumed life: jeans, a flannel shirt, hiking boots. At 34 years old, she could pass for anywhere between 28 and 40. Her face was unremarkable in the way that made her forgettable, which was entirely intentional. No distinctive features. No identifying marks except for a small scar on her left wrist that she kept hidden beneath bracelets and long sleeves. People were terrible at remembering faces anyway, especially faces that didn't demand attention. By 6:15 a.m., Sarah was in her home office, reviewing photography assignments. She genuinely loved photography. This wasn't an act. For 3 years, it had been both her cover and her salvation. The work required patience, discipline, an understanding of distance and angles and light. She excelled at it because excellence was the only speed she knew. Her portfolio was impressive without being exceptional enough to draw real attention. Published in Wildlife Quarterly. One cover in National Geographic that had generated modest interest. She was respected in her niche circles but not famous, not visible, exactly as she designed it. Her assignments for the month included a series on Rocky Mountain goats for a regional publication, editorial work for an outdoor magazine, and stock photography for a travel company. Legitimate work that gave her legitimate reasons to be in the mountains at various hours. Nobody questioned a wildlife photographer's irregular schedule. Nobody thought it suspicious when she was up before dawn or out in remote areas. Her work provided perfect camouflage. The cabin was off-grid except for a satellite internet connection under a business name that had no traceable connection to her true identity. She had a checking account with deposits from her photography clients that covered her modest expenses. Property tax on the cabin came from a trust established 15 years ago by someone named Margaret Holloway, who didn't technically exist anymore. Careful planning, obsessive attention to detail. Sarah made coffee, French press, precisely 4 minutes brewing, and sat at her kitchen table with her laptop. She scrolled through messages from clients, responded with professional courtesy, and scheduled 2 new shoots. Then, almost unconsciously, she opened a hidden browser tab and checked 3 news websites she monitored religiously. Politics, crime, international incidents. Nothing about military operations or special forces activities, nothing that would directly expose her. She was too intelligent for that, but she maintained awareness. Old habits, survival instincts. By 7:30 a.m., she was in her truck, heading toward the mountains east of Billings. She had legitimate work there, a magazine assignment photographing alpine wildlife. The camera bag in her truck contained thousands of dollars in professional equipment, all of it legitimate, all of it useful for her actual job. What it didn't contain was the other equipment she kept in a separate location, a half-hour drive away, in a storage unit under yet another name, at a facility that asked no questions and offered complete privacy. A rifle, ammunition, tactical gear, things that civilians didn't typically possess, things that would raise uncomfortable questions if discovered. She hadn't touched that equipment in 3 years. She told herself she never would again. The mountains were beautiful that time of year, autumn colors bleeding into the evergreen landscape, everything painted in shades of gold and crimson and deep forest green. Sarah had chosen Montana specifically because it was beautiful. She'd read once that people who were running from their pasts often chose locations that could heal them. Mountains, forests, wide open spaces where you could see threats coming from a distance, where you could disappear if necessary, where the landscape demanded nothing from you except respect. She spent the day photographing mountain goats on impossible cliff faces, her camera capturing them in their natural habitat, utterly unaware they were being observed by someone far more dangerous than any predator they'd ever encountered. She worked until the light failed, until the sun dipped below the western peaks and the temperature dropped sharply. As she drove back to the cabin, Sarah's mind drifted, something she rarely allowed. She thought about Colonel Marcus Reeves, her mentor, the man who'd trained her to be extraordinary. She wondered what he was doing where he was if he ever thought about her the way she thought about him. Then she forced the thought away. That life was over. She'd chosen normalcy. She'd chosen silence. But watching the shadows lengthen across the forest, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the past wasn't actually as far away as she'd believed. Something was coming. She could feel it in the way animals sense storms. Colonel James Harrison had been retired for 4 years, but his military bearing remained etched into every fiber of his body. At 61, he still maintained the posture of a man accustomed to command, his shoulders squared, his movements deliberate and economical. He'd moved to Billings to be closer to his daughter and grandchildren, a simple life after 37 years of classified operations and strategic planning. His wife had suggested the grocery store trip as a way to get him out of the house on a Saturday morning. "You'll meet people," she'd said, "normal people, the kind who don't require security clearances." He was in the cereal aisle, staring at the options without really seeing them, when he felt it. That subtle shift in atmospheric pressure that comes from being near someone whose presence registers on a frequency most people can't consciously perceive. Colonel Harrison had trained his entire life to recognize threats, to identify anomalies, to sense when something significant had entered his proximity. He'd survived 3 covert operations in hostile territories by listening to that instinct. He turned slowly, not toward the feeling but away from it, using his peripheral vision. A woman stood 3 aisles over, selecting items from the shelf with methodical precision. Dark hair, pulled back severely, athletic frame, the kind of posture that spoke of military discipline. She moved with a conservational grace that suggested every motion had been calculated. Most civilians move through the world casually, without thought. This woman moved like she was conserving energy for something that mattered. Colonel Harrison's breath caught. He recognized her immediately, not from civilian life, not from the streets of Billings, but from a classified training facility that technically didn't exist, nestled in the mountains of North Carolina, where Special Operations Command trained their most elite operatives. Her face was different than he remembered, thinner, more weathered, shaped by 3 years of civilian life. But the bone structure was unmistakable. The way she carried herself. The precise way her eyes scanned the products before her, calculating value and utility. She'd been codenamed Nightingale during her operational years, though Colonel Harrison couldn't use that name now, couldn't even acknowledge he knew it. She trained under Colonel Marcus "Ghost" Reeves, the most legendarily gifted marksman and tactical operative the military had ever produced. Reeves had hand-picked her from a pool of 300 applicants. In 8 years of service, she'd completed 18 classified operations with a success rate that existed outside normal military statistics, because it was so improbable that it had to be redacted from official records. And then she disappeared. Not defected, not killed in action, simply requested discharge, which she was entitled to do. One day she was the most valuable asset in Special Operations Command. The next she was a civilian, and her file had been sealed with a level of classification that even Colonel Harrison, with his security clearance, couldn't officially access. He knew about her disappearance only because Marcus Reeves had told him in confidence during one of their rare communications. She needed out, Reeves had said quietly. The work was consuming her. I let her go. Best decision I ever made, even though it cost the military more than you can imagine. Now she was in a grocery store in Billings, Montana, selecting cereal and vegetables like she was an ordinary woman leading an ordinary life. Colonel Harrison's military training kicked in. Observe without being obvious. Assess the situation. Calculate probabilities. Was she in hiding? Was this a temporary location or permanent? Was she involved in the judge's situation that had been all over the news? His daughter had mentioned the threats, the federal marshals mobilizing through town. He'd paid attention because that's what he did. He paid attention to operational activities even in retirement. He turned back to his cereal, pretending to consider options while his mind raced. She couldn't know he'd recognized her. The last thing anyone needed was for a former operative of her caliber to be spooked. She was fragile now, in her way, someone rebuilding a life that had been shattered by the weight of classified operations. If she knew she'd been identified, her survival instincts might activate. People like her didn't disappear quietly when threatened. They disappeared completely, erasing digital footprints and relocating before anyone could mount an effective search. Out of the corner of his eye, he watched her move toward the checkout counter. He had seconds to decide. Did he approach her? Did he acknowledge the connection? Or did he do the intelligent thing and contact the appropriate authorities? He set down the cereal box and turned, moving casually in her direction. "Sarah," he said quietly, making sure his voice reached only her. Her entire body went rigid. Her hand, which had been reaching for the conveyor belt, froze mid-motion. Time seemed to compress into a singularity. Then her eyes found his, and he saw the exact moment she recognized him. Not immediately, confusion came first, then a rapid progression of emotions, recognition, shock, fear, and finally something that looked like resignation. For exactly 2 seconds, their eyes locked. Colonel Harrison saw in hers the weight of operational decisions, the burden of secrets, the exhaustion of someone carrying knowledge that could destroy nations. He also saw intelligence, discipline, and the faintest glimmer of the warrior she'd been trained to be. Then she abandoned her shopping basket and moved toward the store exit with controlled speed. Not running, not panicking, but leaving with the purposeful stride of someone whose contingency plans had just activated. "Wait," Colonel Harrison called, but she was already through the automatic doors and disappearing into the parking lot. He stood alone in the grocery store. An old soldier confronting a truth that reordered everything he thought he understood about the woman who'd vanished from military service 3 years ago. That evening, Colonel Harrison made a decision that would ripple through Billings like a stone dropped into still water. He contacted the U.S. Marshals Service. The person who answered was a field agent named Garrett, who handled the threat assessment on the judge's case. "I have information relevant to your investigation," Colonel Harrison said carefully. "There's a woman in your jurisdiction whose background is significantly more classified than you likely realize. Her presence in Billings might not be coincidental." "Who are we talking about?" Agent Garrett asked. "Her civilian name is Sarah Mitchell. She's living in a cabin east of the city. She works as a wildlife photographer, but her actual background involves 8 years of classified Special Operations service under Colonel Marcus Reeves." There was a long pause. Then, "That's impossible. We know if someone with that background was in the area." "Clearly, you wouldn't," Colonel Harrison said, "because she's better at disappearing than most people are at existing. But she's here. And given the recent threat assessment on the federal judge, I believe you need to know about her immediately." By the next morning, federal agents were mobilizing towards Sarah's cabin, armed with questions and suspicions, and no idea what they were actually walking into. Colonel Harrison, sitting in his living room with his wife, watched the news coverage with grim satisfaction. He'd done what duty demanded. But some part of him, the part that remembered military brotherhood and the sacred trust between soldiers, wondered if he just destroyed someone who'd been desperately trying to rebuild her life. Sarah heard the vehicles before she saw them. The sound of multiple engines, carefully coordinated, approaching from the main road that led to her property. She was on her porch, coffee in hand, watching the forest wake up to the morning light. The sound wasn't alarming because it was loud. It was alarming because it was precise. This wasn't lost hikers or curious neighbors. This was a coordinated operation. She set down her coffee mug with deliberate calm and assessed the situation with the same tactical clarity that had kept her alive through 8 years of classified operations. 3 vehicles based on the engine sounds. 7 to 9 personnel, probably. They were moving with purpose but not haste, which meant they weren't expecting immediate resistance. They were treating her as a person of interest, not a threat. That was actually to her advantage, though she wasn't sure which advantage yet. By the time the first SUV emerged from the tree line, Sarah was already standing, hands visible, posture non-threatening but alert. Her mind raced through possibilities. They'd found her. The question was, had they found her because of something she'd done or because someone had reported her? The second seemed more likely. Colonel Harrison. It had to be. The recognition in the grocery store, the way she'd bolted, he'd done his patriotic duty. 12 federal agents emerged from the vehicles, moving in coordinated formation with practiced efficiency. They weren't SWAT, not yet, but they were armed and trained. The lead agent was a woman in her mid-40s with steel-gray eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. She approached Sarah with her credentials already displayed. "Sarah Mitchell?" the agent asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Yes," Sarah said. "No point in denying the obvious." "I'm Agent Alina Vasquez, U.S. Marshals Service. We need to ask you some questions. We can do this here or we can do this at the federal building in Billings. Your choice." Sarah had played this scenario dozens of times in her head during the 3 years she'd been in hiding. She'd never actually decided what she'd do if it happened. Now, facing it, she realized there was only one reasonable choice: comply. Fighting would only accelerate everything, only confirm their suspicions, only guarantee that her carefully constructed life was over anyway. "I'll cooperate," Sarah said. "Can I at least get a jacket?" They took her inside, 2 agents accompanying her to the bedroom, watching as she pulled on a dark windbreaker. Checkpoint 1, physical search of the cabin. They were careful and methodical, clearly operating under a warrant. She watched them discover the photography equipment, the legitimate business records, the normal things that comprised her civilian existence. Then they found the locked steel case in the closet. Agent Vasquez opened it with a key from Sarah's key ring, and Sarah watched her expression shift from professional curiosity to something harder, colder. The documents were there. The identities, the cash, the weapons, all of it. "Well," Agent Vasquez said quietly, "that changes things." The interrogation room at the federal building was exactly what Sarah had expected. Concrete fluorescent lighting, a metal table, chairs that were deliberately uncomfortable. Agent Vasquez sat across from her, a file folder between them. Two other agents stood against the back wall, silent observers. A camera recorded everything from the corner. Sarah had been through training on how to handle interrogation, how to maintain psychological control, how to resist manipulation. But she'd also been trained to recognize when the game was over. "Talk to me about Marcus Reeves," Agent Vasquez said, opening with her strongest card. Sarah didn't respond immediately. She studied the agent's face, looking for tells, for signs of what she actually knew versus what she was fishing for. Vasquez's patience indicated professional competence. She wasn't going to rush. She was going to let silence do the work. After 47 seconds, Sarah spoke. "He's a retired colonel, Special Operations Command. I'm not going to say anything else about him without legal representation." "You're not under arrest yet," Vasquez said. "You're cooperating. That's actually working in your favor. Help me understand what's happening here." Sarah considered her options with the same tactical calculus that had guided her through a decade of military service. Full silence would guarantee legal protection, but also guarantee suspicion. Partial cooperation might actually reduce the threat level if she could make them understand that she was irrelevant to whatever they were investigating. "I served in special operations," Sarah said finally. 8 years. I was trained by Colonel Reeves. I left 3 years ago. My discharge was legitimate. I requested separation, I was processed out, and I've been living a civilian life since then. That's all there is." "Why did you leave?" Vasquez asked. Sarah met her eyes. "Because the work was destroying me. Because I needed to remember what it felt like to be human. Because I no longer wanted to be a weapon." There was something in her tone that made the agent pause. It was raw, honest, the kind of vulnerability that suggested she wasn't lying. Vasquez glanced at the agents behind her, then back at Sarah. "The weapons in your cabin. Why do you keep them if you're done with that life?" "Insurance," Sarah said simply. "The kind of work I did, the places I went, the people I worked against, some of them have long memories. Some of them have resources. I keep weapons because if certain people discover where I am, I want to have a fighting chance. That doesn't mean I'm planning to use them. It means I'm surviving." The interrogation continued for 8 hours. They asked her about the judge, about threats, about her connection to the white supremacist organization. She answered truthfully. She had no connection. She didn't follow politics closely. She'd been aware of the threats because federal agents had been conspicuous in the community, but she hadn't been involved in any way. Slowly, Agent Vasquez's suspicion shifted. Sarah wasn't the threat. Sarah was a ghost, a professionally trained operative who'd successfully disappeared into civilian life. The fact that she was in Billings was coincidence, not conspiracy. "I need to speak with Colonel Marcus Reeves," Vasquez said finally. "That's your decision," Sarah replied. "He won't confirm anything without authorization from the Pentagon. But if you reach him, you might understand why he trained me the way he did and why I needed to leave. The military doesn't create balanced people. It creates tools. I needed to remember how to be a person." By the time they released her that evening, as the sun was bleeding red across the mountains, something fundamental had changed. Sarah's secret was no longer secret. The federal government knew who she was. The marshals knew what she'd been trained to do. And in the coming days, the full weight of that revelation would begin to reshape her life in ways she couldn't control. As she sat in the federal building's parking lot waiting for the ride back to her cabin, Sarah realized something with terrible clarity. The life she'd built, the photography, the solitude, the careful anonymity, was finished. Everything she'd constructed to escape her past had just been irrevocably dismantled. The only question now was what would rise from the ashes. The federal building's conference room smelled like burnt coffee and desperation. Sarah sat at a long table surrounded by agents, specialists, and analysts whose faces betrayed the kind of stress that comes from a situation spiraling beyond their control. 3 days had passed since her interrogation. 3 days in which the threat against Judge Robert Castellano had metastasized from theoretical danger into actionable intelligence. Agent Vasquez stood at the head of the table, her jaw clenched as she reviewed the latest threat assessment. "We've intercepted communications," she said, her voice tight. "The organization has moved from threats to operational planning. They have a timeline. They're acquiring equipment. This isn't posturing anymore." Sarah listened quietly from her position against the far wall. She wasn't supposed to be here. The marshals had offered her protection, should have provided protection given that she was now a person of interest to extremist groups who might view her military background as either a recruitment opportunity or a threat to be eliminated. But Sarah had refused protective custody. Instead, she'd agreed to limited cooperation, which apparently meant sitting in conference rooms while federal agents deliberated about her continued existence. "The white supremacist network has connections to tactical trained individuals," a younger analyst named Morrison said, pulling up files on the projection screen. "We've identified 3 potential operatives who have conducted reconnaissance on the courthouse. We're tracking their movements, but they're sophisticated. They know surveillance countermeasures." Sarah's stomach tightened. She recognized the tactical markers he was describing. These weren't amateurs playing at terrorism. These were people with actual training, actual discipline. The kind of people who understood how to plan an operation against a high-value target. "What kind of timeline are we talking?" asked Special Agent Chen, who'd been assigned as lead coordinator for the judge's protection detail. "Could be within 2 weeks, Vasquez said. "Possibly sooner. They're in the final stages of preparation." Sarah felt the weight of the room's anxiety pressing down on her. These were competent people, but competent people didn't always understand the way truly trained operatives thought. They didn't understand the mentality of someone who'd been taught to see obstacles as puzzles to be solved, security measures as challenges to be overcome. "Sarah," Agent Vasquez said, finally acknowledging her presence, "we need to ask you directly. Is there any possibility that someone from your past, someone you trained with, someone who knew you, is involved in this?" Sarah met the agent's eyes. "No, the people I worked with didn't operate in this way, and if they did, they wouldn't advertise it. They wouldn't make threats. They'd execute cleanly and disappear. These people are different. They're driven by ideology, not professionalism. That's actually what makes them more dangerous." "How so?" Chen asked. "Professionals can be predicted," Sarah explained. "They follow doctrine, they minimize risk, they calculate probabilities. Ideologues are unpredictable. They'll take suicidal risks if they believe the cause justifies it. They'll make mistakes, but you can't rely on them making the mistakes you expect." There was a long silence. Then Morrison pulled up a new image. "We have visual confirmation of someone conducting surveillance from this location." He highlighted a commercial building 2 blocks from the courthouse. "Thermal imaging suggests rooftop placement, possible sniper nest." Sarah stood immediately, moving closer to the screen. Her operational instincts were screaming at her to stay uninvolved, but her professional curiosity overrode everything else. She studied the layout with the tactical clarity of someone who'd been trained to understand sight lines, fields of fire, extraction routes. "That's not optimal," she said quietly. "Excuse me," Chen asked. "The position you've identified. It's adequate, but it's not where a competent sniper would set up. Too much exposure to counter-sniper fire from the buildings to the north." The wind patterns at that elevation would complicate ballistics, and the extraction route is problematic. Only two viable approaches, both likely to be under surveillance. The room went quiet. Everyone was watching her. "If I were planning this operation," Sarah continued, unable to stop herself despite knowing she should, "I'd position the primary sniper on the warehouse district. Specifically, the Miller Building, the old industrial complex 3 blocks east. Rooftop has thermal cover from the equipment housing below. Wind patterns are more predictable at that lower elevation, and there's access to the adjacent structures that would provide exit options." Agent Vasquez exchanged a look with Chen. Then she was on the phone, coordinating with teams in the field, relaying Sarah's assessment, adjusting the security perimeter based on her tactical analysis. Sarah returned to her seat, feeling something she hadn't felt in 3 years: relevance, usefulness, the terrible intoxication of being needed for exactly the thing she'd been trained to do. It was addictive in the way all drugs were addictive, dangerous, seductive, and impossible to refuse once you'd remembered what the high felt like. Over the next 2 hours, the federal response reorganized itself around Sarah's suggestions. Counter-sniper teams were repositioned. Surveillance was enhanced on the buildings she'd identified as tactically superior. Thermal imaging was upgraded. By noon, Sarah had essentially redesigned the federal government's protection strategy for Judge Castellano, and the agents in the room had begun treating her not as a person of interest but as an invaluable asset. "Thank you," Vasquez said as the meeting concluded. "Your insight has probably saved the judge's life." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She felt contaminated by usefulness, by the knowledge that she'd been drawn back into the operational mindset. For 3 years, she'd successfully kept that part of herself locked away. Now it was awake again, alert, hungry. That night, Sarah sat in her cabin with a glass of whiskey she didn't normally drink, staring into the darkness. Agent Vasquez had assigned a protective detail to her property, 2 agents in a vehicle at the end of her driveway, supposedly for her protection but really as a security measure in case she proved unreliable. She understood now what was happening. The federal government had initially treated her with suspicion, but her cooperation had transformed her into a resource. They would use her expertise. They would appreciate her contributions. And when this was over, they would expect her to continue being useful. Sarah had spent 3 years running from exactly this situation. She'd spent 3 years trying to be ordinary, trying to be forgotten, trying to believe that someone with her training could ever actually disappear. The whiskey burned as it went down, matching the burn of recognition that her carefully constructed life had been a fantasy. The only question that remained was what she would do when the moment arrived, when her expertise wasn't merely advisory but actively required. When the choice became, return to the work or watch innocence die because she'd refused to use the only skills that actually mattered. The judge's motorcade was scheduled for transport in 4 days. The threat assessment suggested violence would occur within that window. Sarah had 72 hours before she'd have to confront the thing she'd been running from since she requested discharge. She finished her drink and sat in the darkness, waiting for time to drag her toward an inevitable reckoning she'd never actually escaped. The operations center was controlled chaos. Monitors displayed every angle of Judge Castellano's movements. Thermal imaging revealed body heat signatures across rooftops and streets. Radio chatter crackled in controlled bursts. Sarah stood in the corner, watching everything, her hands clenched into fists so tight her nails cut crescents into her palms. The judge was 10 minutes out. Agent Vasquez paced the length of the room, her focus absolute. Counter-sniper teams were positioned at the locations Sarah had recommended. Additional security surrounded the motorcade. Everything that could be done had been done. And yet Sarah could feel it, a vibration in the electromagnetic spectrum only someone with her training could perceive. The sense that despite all precautions, despite all calculations, something was about to go catastrophically wrong. 9 minutes. On Monitor 7, thermal imaging showed the warehouse district. Sarah watched it like a hawk watches prey. The Miller Building, the rooftop. She'd identified it as the optimal position, and the federal teams had secured the perimeter, but something in her gut wasn't satisfied. There was a gap, a blind spot. Somewhere in the geometry of buildings and angles, there was a space where a competent operator could still establish position. 8 minutes. Her hands began to shake, not from fear, from recognition, from the muscle memory that had been dormant for 3 years suddenly becoming reactivated. She knew what was about to happen. She could feel it the way animals felt earthquakes before they struck the surface. "Agent Vasquez," Sarah said quietly. "Not now," Vasquez replied, not turning from her monitors. 7 minutes. Sarah made a decision. She moved toward the armory, a room adjoining the operations center where tactical equipment was stored. Inside, secured in a locked rack, were several precision rifles. She'd trained with thousands of different weapons, but these were professional-grade, military standard, the kind of instruments that could perform miracles in the right hands. Her hands were still the right hands. She removed one rifle, checked the action with practiced efficiency, verified the sight system. Around her, nobody was paying attention. The tactical teams were distributed across the city. The agents in the operations center were focused on their monitors. And Sarah, for the first time in 3 years, allowed herself to become what she'd spent so long trying not to be. 6 minutes. She was out the back door before anyone noticed. The federal building had a roof access. She'd noted it during her first day here, the same way she noted everything about any location she occupied. Exits, sightlines, tactical advantages. The habit was permanent, burned into her neural pathways. The roof was concrete and exposed to the October wind. Sarah moved low, staying below the building's edge until she reached the position she'd identified earlier. A rooftop of an adjacent structure, 3 buildings over, with clear sightlines to the Miller Building and the courthouse beyond. She'd spent her entire military career learning to think like this, to see the world as a 3-dimensional puzzle where death could be delivered from impossible distances. 5 minutes. She set up position with hands that remembered every motion perfectly. The rifle settled against her shoulder like a returning lover. Her eye found the scope with unconscious precision. The world compressed into the magnified circle of her vision. Everything else, her civilian life, her 3 years of attempted normalcy, her carefully constructed lie about being ordinary, fell away. What remained was clarity. The motorcade would approach from the north. The optimal firing position for an opposing sniper would be the Miller Building's rooftop, but she'd already identified that. So where would a truly exceptional operator position themselves? Someone who understood counter-sniper doctrine, someone who anticipated the federal response. There, the old warehouse, 300 yards east. A position so slightly non-obvious that it would take someone with her exact training to recognize it as viable. A roof structure that would be nearly invisible to standard surveillance, with a firing angle that would work if the shooter understood ballistics at elevation and distance the way only a handful of people in the world did. 4 minutes. Sarah adjusted her scope toward the location. For 30 seconds she saw nothing. Then a reflection caught her eye, sunlight on glass. A scope. The opposing sniper was already in position, already drawing a bead on the approaching motorcade. 3 minutes. The motorcade appeared on her peripheral monitors. The tactical team was broadcasting video feed on all frequencies. 4 vehicles, armor plating, armed escort. Judge Castellano was inside the second vehicle, protected but not invulnerable. If a sufficiently trained operator could put a round through the motorcade's ballistic windows at the precise angle, they could still make the shot. The opposing sniper was attempting exactly that. Sarah breathed, just breathed. The world slowed to the pace of her heartbeat. She could see him now through her scope, a man in dark tactical gear, focused, trained, dangerous, but not as trained as her, not as dangerous as what she'd become. 2 minutes. The motorcade accelerated slightly, the drivers understanding through their radios that threat level had spiked. Sarah calculated. At the motorcade's current speed, traveling at the angle of approach, the judge would be vulnerable for exactly 11 seconds as the vehicles passed through the optimal firing zone for both snipers. 1 minute. The opposing sniper exhaled. Sarah recognized the physiological marker of someone preparing to fire. 70 seconds until he squeezed the trigger. 60 seconds for her to make a decision that would change everything. 45 seconds. The motorcade entered the zone. 30 seconds. The opposing sniper's finger found the trigger. 15 seconds. Sarah fired. Her round traveled 417 yards through air and space in consequence. In the scope, she watched it travel, watched the trajectory intersect perfectly with the opposing bullet in mid-flight. Physics and mathematics colliding in three-dimensional space. The opposing round fragmented, its energy dispersed, its lethal intent neutralized. The opposing sniper's weapon discharged, but the round went harmlessly wide, impacted concrete, ricocheted into the October sky. In the motorcade, the judge remained unharmed, untouched by the violence that had been narrowly prevented. Sarah chambered another round with automatic precision, but the opposing sniper was already moving. She tracked him through her scope, had a clear shot, could have ended this completely. But she didn't fire. She'd accomplished what mattered. She'd stopped the assassination. Now everything would change. Below in the operations center, alarms were screaming. Radio chatter exploded. Agent Vasquez was shouting orders to teams throughout the city. Security personnel were converging on the location of the opposing sniper, but Sarah knew, with absolute certainty, that they would find the position empty. A professional operator, realizing they were being tracked by someone with superior skills, would have an extraction plan. Sarah ejected the magazine from the rifle and set it carefully on the rooftop. Then she stood, hands raised, waiting for the federal agents who would come searching for the sound of the shot. Her 3 years of civilian life were over. The moment she pulled that trigger, she'd made a choice she couldn't unmake. She'd revealed herself not just as someone who'd been trained by the military, but as someone who remained the lethal instrument they'd created. The legend had returned to the world. And there was no going back. The federal agents who found Sarah on the rooftop didn't rush her. She stood with her hands raised, the rifle on the ground beside her, and watched their faces process what they were seeing. A woman, civilian clothes, military precision, the impossible convergence of everything they'd been searching for. "Don't move," one agent said, though his tone suggested he knew she wouldn't. Sarah remained motionless as they secured her, zip-tied her wrists, escorted her back inside the federal building. But instead of returning her to an interrogation room, they took her to the operations center. Agent Vasquez was waiting, and her expression was complicated, gratitude mixed with something deeper, something that looked like awe. "You stopped him," Vasquez said. "The ballistic analysis shows you intercepted his round mid-flight. I don't even have words for that. That's not something most people could accomplish." "I was trained by the best," Sarah replied quietly. Within 2 hours, the story began spreading through secure federal channels. A former special operations operative had intervened in an assassination attempt. The shot itself, the ballistic physics of it, the tactical impossibility of it, became the subject of heated discussion among military specialists and tactical experts. By the next morning, the story had leaked to the press. "Woman sniper stops federal judge's assassination," read the headlines. "Mystery operative reveals hidden past during bungled extremist attack." News vans descended on Billings like vultures. Journalists were already digging, trying to piece together Sarah's identity, her background, the trajectory that had led her to the rooftop. The federal government, rather than maintaining operational security, made a calculated decision. They released a statement acknowledging Sarah's role in stopping the assassination attempt, describing her as a former military operative whose quick thinking and exceptional skills saved Judge Castellano's life. They didn't name her initially, but they did something more damaging. They opened the door for her identity to become public. Sarah watched it happen from a secure federal facility where she was being held for her own protection. Within 72 hours, someone, likely an intelligence analyst with a conscience or a journalist with good sources, revealed her name. Sarah Mitchell, former Special Operations, 8 years of classified service, trained by Colonel Marcus Reeves. The dam broke. Former colleagues began speaking, carefully but deliberately. Retired military officers granted interviews where they discussed, in carefully worded language, a young operative who had been exceptionally talented and exemplary in every way. Snippets of her reputation filtered into public consciousness. A person who'd been professionally invisible for a decade was suddenly the subject of magazine profiles and documentary discussions. Colonel Marcus Reeves did something he hadn't done in 30 years. He granted an interview. He was older now, in his mid-70s, gray-bearded, his tactical bearing softened by age but not diminished. He sat across from a journalist from a major network and spoke carefully, choosing his words with the precision of someone accustomed to classified protocols. "Sarah Mitchell was one of the finest operatives I've ever trained," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen hundreds of soldiers and selected only the exceptional. She possessed qualities you can't teach: discipline, moral clarity, precision, and a kind of intuitive tactical understanding that separates truly exceptional people from merely competent ones. She was extraordinary. "Why do you think she left?" the journalist asked. Reeves paused, considering the question. "Because she realized that what we train people to do, comes at a psychological cost that most people aren't equipped to handle. Sarah was intelligent enough to recognize that cost and brave enough to walk away from it. That's not weakness. That's strength. The fact that she was willing to come back, even briefly, to prevent loss of life tells you everything you need to know about her character." The interview aired nationally. Within hours, Sarah Mitchell was no longer an unknown operative. She was a legend, a woman who'd rejected violence and then been forced back into it by circumstances beyond her control. Sarah sat in a federal safe house, watching her own mythology being constructed in real time. She saw the footage of herself on the rooftop. She read the analysis of her shot, ballistics experts breaking down the physics of how a round could intersect another round mid-flight, concluding that such a feat required someone with extraordinary skill and years of training. There were offers. Universities wanted to interview her. Military organizations wanted to recruit her. Publishers wanted her story. Defense contractors wanted her expertise. Everyone wanted a piece of the legend that Sarah Mitchell had become, not through seeking it but through being forced back into the light she'd spent 3 years trying to escape. Agent Vasquez visited her on the 5th day after the shot. She brought coffee and sat across from Sarah in the safe house's living room. "We've cleared you of any criminal charges," Vasquez said. "In fact, the government is considering offering you a position, not forced service, an option. We could use someone like you in various capacities." Sarah stared at her coffee. "And if I say no?" "Then you're free to go. You'll face media attention probably for months, but legally you're not obligated to do anything. You saved a federal judge's life. You're a hero, at least from a public relations standpoint." Sarah laughed, a bitter sound. "I'm not a hero. I'm a woman who was trained to be a weapon and then was forced to use that training when I'd spent 3 years pretending I wasn't a weapon anymore." "Maybe," Vasquez said. "Or maybe you're someone who chose in the moment that mattered to prevent innocent death. That's heroic regardless of your training." Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah made her decision. She declined the federal job offer. She declined most of the media interviews. Instead, she requested something unusual: Time to figure out who she actually was, separate from the legend, separate from the training, separate from the mythology that had suddenly consumed her life. The federal government reluctantly agreed, though they insisted on limited security for her protection. Sarah stood at her cabin window, looking at the Montana wilderness that had been her refuge and her prison. The trees didn't care that she'd become famous. The mountains didn't change because her identity was exposed. The world she'd tried to escape had caught up with her, but this landscape remained constant. She'd been offered so many futures in the past weeks: return to military service, work for private security firms, consulting, speaking engagements, publishing deals. Each one represented a way to monetize what she'd been trained to do, to make use of the exceptional skills that had made her extraordinary. Or she could walk away again, choose a different life, maybe different from Billings, maybe different from photography, but a life that was hers, not the life her training had prepared her for. Standing at the window, Sarah understood something with terrible clarity. She'd been given a gift she hadn't asked for and didn't want: the ability to see herself clearly. Not as the operative she'd been trained to be, not as the civilian she'd pretended to be, but as a person who possessed both capabilities and had to decide which identity would ultimately define her. The shot that stopped the assassination had answered one question. She could still do the work if absolutely necessary. Now she faced a harder question: should she? The answer wouldn't come easily. But for the first time in 3 years, Sarah Mitchell was ready to stop running and start choosing. Whatever came next would be her decision, unforced and deliberate. The legend could wait. First, she needed to figure out who the woman underneath the legend actually wanted to be.
Questo cosa fa? Ah, ok, fa uscire un po' di blu. Che io posso portare di là, da qui. Basta fare così. E a tempo. Oh. Oddio, mi sa che devo fare un percorso. Ok, questa non è facilissima. Però non è neanche difficilissima, sembrerebbe. Però, secondo me questo è azzeccato. Però non so ancora il perché. Lo faccio arrivare fino in fondo. Poi in realtà posso continuare a farlo io. Stai lurcando? Lurchi? Cucini? Ah no, non me la fa fare perché ci sono ancora quelli.